The PGA Tour is set to announce the 4 additional events with elevated status for 2023. This comes in addition to the 9 that were already announced back in August at the Tour Championship. Now, the 4 new elevated events are expected to be the WM Phoenix Open, RBC Heritage, the Wells Fargo Championship, and the Travelers Championship as well. And as you can see right there on your screen, they join the likes of the Players, the playoff events, and the invitationals in elevated status. So what does that mean? Well, at the Tour Championship, you recall in August, Commissioner Jay Monahan announced a number of changes to the future structure of the Tour to combat live golf and future defections. In that announcement, the commissioner introduced the idea of elevated events that would guarantee the presence of the game's biggest names, as well as a purse of at least $20 million. How about that? Emil Lynch is coming together. We got Phoenix in February, RBC, Hilton Head in April. We're seeing kind of a geographic diversity. We're seeing a schedule come together.
These are the final pieces of the puzzle of these elevated events that Jay Monahan announced back in August. And it's key to note that this is based on the schedule that had already been published and announced by the PGA Tour before the idea of elevated events even emerged. So they had little room to work with. And that's why you see so many compromises in a way in this. We're already seeing our Canadian friends wondering why the RBC event at Hilton Head is elevated rather than the Canadian Open. Well, if you look at the schedule, there's a 4-week stretch that goes from the Memorial to the Canadian Open to the US Open and then to the Travelers. So if the Travelers is going to be elevated, that would be 4 in a row.
Right.
That would be elevated when you add in major championships as well. So everything tends to be something of a compromise, and players are going to have to compromise as well, Damon. We know players who have for many years skipped the Phoenix Open simply because the vibe isn't to everyone's taste out there. And it changes the vibe as well of the RBC Heritage, which has always been known as a kind of a low-key decompression week after the Masters. Now you're going to have the best players in the world there. And there are others that benefit. I mean, particularly, I think, Wells Fargo always draws a strong field, I think, at Quail Hollow.
Yeah.
But it fits into a perfect point in the schedule for them coming 2 weeks before the PGA Championship. Maybe not as good news for the Byron Nelson, which comes the next week before the PGA Championship. So there's just a lot of give and take here, for sure.
In Quail Hollow, let's be honest, the President's Cup, Quail Hollow continued to look incredible. The crowds there were remarkable as well. Surely the Tour wanting to take advantage of that market. But what about, in your reporting, have you heard about the potential for rotating events? Now, these 4 events are clearly happy. The sponsors will be happy, the fans. But what about some of the other events? Will they have an opportunity to be elevated in the future? Yes,
based on the sources I've talked to, the 4 that will be announced this week, the players are due to be informed tomorrow of this news, is that those events will rotate. The 9 that were previously announced are permanently elevated, but they will rotate for every year in an attempt to give every sponsor and tournament the opportunity to have an elevated field every few years. Perhaps they don't necessarily want to make the investment for every year because it is a substantial number that we're talking to get to that elevated status. But this would rotate the events around a little more. Plus, once you start to go back to a 2024 calendar year schedule, then you can potentially move tournaments around, because that's also an issue the Tour is going to have to face, is if a sponsor wants an elevated event, it depends very much where that event falls on the schedule in relation to other elevated events and commitments. So you may see a schedule that juggles a little bit more than we've seen over the past years, where people have become used to seeing certain tournaments in certain places all the time. But the real key that we now have to see now is who are the top 20 players who are going to be guaranteed here, because that's actually determined by the Player Impact Programme. And the criteria for that has changed. It's taken out a little social media element, added an awareness element. Still kind of a vaguely defined form to come up with those 20 names. But it's worth noting that the Player Impact Programme doubled in size this year from $50 million to $100 million and will reward 20 players instead of 10. So the Tour is compensating these guys for the commitment to these events a year ahead of them doing it.
There seemed to be some unknowns in August when the Commissioner Jay Monahan addressed the media at the Tour Championship. It looks like things are starting to become more and more clear.